Hey guys, tonight we are going to sit with one of the strangest and most quietly haunting disappearances in modern American memory. A case with a detail so simple and so impossible that it has puzzled people for 20 years. A young man walked into a bar. Cameras recorded him going in. And then, though the bar had one main way in and out that was watched by a camera, no footage ever recorded him coming back out. His name was Brian Shaffer, and he was 27 years old, a medical student with a bright future and a family who loved him. And in the early hours of April 1st, 2006, he vanished from inside a Columbus bar as completely as if the building had simply swallowed him. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you find real value in what we do here. There is no pressure and no guilt. Thank you, truly, for the case suggestions that keep finding their way to us. We are also now on Spotify, so the link is in the description if you would rather listen there while you drift off tonight. Now dim the lights and get comfortable. This is a long one, and Brian's story deserves to be told slowly and carefully and with respect, because Brian was a real young man, a son and a brother and a partner, a person on the edge of a whole life in medicine, and he vanished at a moment when his family was already grieving a fresh and terrible loss. This is not a story with an ending. It is an open question that has stood for 20 years, and we are going to treat it the way it deserves, without sensationalism, without accusation, and without pretending to know what no one yet knows. Have you ever wondered how a grown man can walk into an ordinary bar in the middle of a city, surrounded by people and cameras, and simply cease to exist, leaving behind a puzzle so clean and so strange that it sounds like a riddle rather than a real event? That is the heart of Brian Shaffer's case. The bare facts of it are almost too neat to be true. He went in, he was seen inside, he was never seen coming out the way he came in, and he was never seen again. To understand how that could happen, and to hold the mystery with the care it deserves, we have to begin with who Brian was, and with the particular grief he was carrying on the night he disappeared. Brian Shaffer was born in the winter of 1979, and by the spring of 2006, he was a young man of 27, with his life pointed towards something meaningful. He was a second-year medical student at Ohio State University in Columbus, training to become a doctor, one of the demanding and hopeful paths a young person can choose. By every account, he was intelligent, warm, well-liked, the kind of young man who had friends easily and a future clearly in view. He was close with his family, in a serious relationship, and moving steadily toward the life of a physician. He was, in short, a young man with every reason to want to live the life in front of him, which is part of what makes his disappearance so difficult to understand. It is worth dwelling on what it means to be a second-year medical student, because it tells you something about the kind of young man Brian was and the kind of future he was building. Medical school is one of the most demanding paths a person can choose, a grinding, competitive, years-long commitment that asks enormous discipline and dedication. A person does not stumble into it. Brian had worked hard to get where he was, had chosen a difficult road toward a life of service, had committed himself to the long apprenticeship that turns a student into a physician. That choice tells you he was serious, capable, and oriented toward a future, a young man who had set his sights on something meaningful and was doing the hard work to reach it. It is one more thing that sits uneasily with the idea of a young man who simply walked away, though we will hold that theory open all the same. Those who knew Brian described a warm and genuine person, easy to like, the kind of friend people were glad to have. He had a serious relationship with Alexis, a bond that mattered to him. He had his father and his brother, a close family. He had the ordinary rich web of connections that a well-liked young person accumulates, friends and classmates and the people of his daily life. He was not isolated, not troubled in any way that anyone had noticed, not a young man on the margins. He was woven into a life, which is exactly why his disappearance landed so hard, because a person this connected does not simply slip away unnoticed. When Brian vanished, he tore a hole in a whole fabric of relationships, and everyone who had been part of that fabric felt it. You're in the ordinary texture of Brian's life in the weeks before he vanished, and it is the busy, demanding, hopeful life of a young man on his way to becoming a doctor. There are the long hours of study, the weight of the material, the pressure of the training. There are the friends and the girlfriend and the family, the human anchors that make the grind bearable. And running underneath all of it, in those particular weeks, there is the fresh grief for his mother, a private weight he carried alongside everything else. It is an ordinary life, a good life, a life pointed toward a meaningful future. And it is the life that Brian stepped out of, or was taken from, on a night at the start of a spring break. Holding that ordinary, hopeful life in view is part of understanding the size of what was lost. But there is a shadow over that spring that we have to hold at the center of this story, because it is essential to understanding the full human context of Brian's disappearance. Only weeks before he vanished, Brian's mother, Renee, had died. She had suffered from a serious blood disorder, and her death came in March of 2006, in the very weeks before Brian went missing. So the young man who walked into that bar on the last night anyone can account for was not simply a carefree student out celebrating. He was a grieving son, freshly bereaved, carrying the raw and disorienting loss of his mother, a loss that had come suddenly into the middle of his young life. That grief matters. It is part of who Brian was in those weeks, and it would become part of how people tried to understand what happened to him. We raise Brian's grief gently and with a promise, because it will become important later. When a person disappears not long after a devastating loss, one of the possibilities that people naturally consider is whether the grief itself played some role, whether the pain of it might have led the person to step away from their life. We will discuss that possibility carefully later on, as one branch among several, but we will do it without ever presuming to diagnose Brian, without turning his private grief into a tidy explanation, and without pretending to know the inner state of a young man we never met. For now, it is enough to hold the simple human fact at the center. Brian had just lost his mother. He was grieving, and he was, by every account, still a young man engaged with his life, his studies, his relationship, and his future. The timing of his mother's death gives the whole story an added layer of sorrow that is worth sitting with for a moment. To lose a parent is one of the great griefs of a life, and to lose one young in your 20s is a particular kind of wound, the early arrival of a loss most people do not face until later. Renee's illness had been serious, a blood disorder that took her life, and her death in March would have been a shattering event in Brian's world. the loss of his mother in the middle of his demanding training, in the middle of his young adulthood. He would have been raw with it, in the earliest and hardest weeks of grief, when the loss is still fresh and disorienting, and the world has not yet rearranged itself around the absence. That is the young man who went out on the night of March 31st, a person carrying a very recent and very heavy loss. It does not tell us what happened to him, but it is essential context because it is the emotional weather he was living in, and because it would later shape how people tried to make sense of his disappearance. A grieving person is not fully themselves. Grief can make the world feel unreal, can dull or sharpen emotion in unpredictable ways, can leave a person moving through their days at a slight remove from everything. We cannot know how Brian's grief was moving in him that night, but we can hold with compassion the simple fact that he was carrying it, that the young man who stepped out of that camera frame was a son who had very recently lost his mother. Have you ever wondered how grief can hollow out even the strongest person in ways that are invisible from the outside? How a person can be functioning, studying, going out with friends, and still be quietly unmoored underneath? We do not know that this is what was happening with Brian, but it is part of the human backdrop of his case, the reminder that he was not a puzzle piece, but a grieving young man, and that whatever happened to him happened to a person already carrying a great deal. To be fair, most grieving people, however heavy their loss, do not disappear, and grief alone explains nothing. But it is part of the truth of who Brian was that spring, and any honest telling has to hold it, gently, as context and not as answer. Picture the shape of Brian's world in that spring of 2006. He had his father, Randy, and his brother Derek, and a girlfriend, Alexis Wagoner, whom he was close with, though she was in another city that particular night. He had his place in the demanding world of medical school, his friends, his apartment near campus, the ordinary furniture of a young man's busy life. The end of that March marked the start of spring break, a pause in the relentless schedule of medical training, a moment to breathe. And so, on the night of March 31st going into April 1st, Brian went out to mark the start of the break, to be with a friend, to have some drinks, to step for a few hours out of the grief and the grind. It was an ordinary plan for an ordinary night. It became the night he disappeared. Let's set the scene of that night with care, because the geography of it is central to the whole mystery. The place Brian went was a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloona, located in a development called the South Campus Gateway, along High Street near the Ohio State campus. The Gateway was a newer complex of shops and restaurants and entertainment, the kind of place that anchors the nightlife of a big university district. The Ugly Tuna sat up above street level, and the main way that patrons reached it and left it was by an escalator, a single principal route in and out that carried people up from the street level into the bar and back down again. That escalator and the camera that watched it would become the strange fixed point at the center of Brian Shaffer's disappearance. You're in the South Campus Gateway on the last night of March in 2006, and it is an ordinary busy night in a college bar district. The shops are closed, but the bars are alive, students and young people moving through the complex, up and down the escalator, in and out of the Ugly Tuna. High Street runs past outside, the main artery of the campus nightlife. It is a modern, well-lit, heavily used public space, exactly the kind of place where a person is surrounded by others and watched by cameras, exactly the kind of place where it should be impossible to simply vanish. And it is here, in this ordinary, crowded, modern place, that Brian Shaffer walked into a mystery that has never been solved. Let's walk through the night carefully, because it has been reconstructed in some detail, and every part of it matters. Early in the evening, around 9, Brian met up with a friend, a young man named Clint Florence, at the Ugly Tuna. We pause at that first name to say what we will say about everyone in this story. Clint Florence was a friend of Brian's who was with him that night, and he has never been charged with any crime. And we name him only because the documented account of the evening names him. Whatever else we discuss later, that presumption of innocence holds from the first mention to the last. The two of them were out together at the start of the evening, two friends beginning a night at the start of spring break. As the evening went on, Brian did the ordinary things a person does on a night out. Around 10, he spoke by phone with his girlfriend, Alexis, who was in another city that night. An ordinary check-in between two people in a relationship. Later, after midnight, the night moved elsewhere for a while, into another part of Columbus, the Short North District, where the group connected with an acquaintance, a young woman named Meredith Reed. We extend to her the same presumption we extend to everyone, naming her only because the record does. Meredith Reed drove Brian and Clint back toward the campus area, back toward the Ugly Tuna Saloona, in the small hours of the morning. And it is at that return that the surveillance record picks Brian up again and begins the strange sequence that has puzzled people ever since. One thing worth noticing about the whole reconstructed night is how completely ordinary it was, right up to the vanishing. Brian did the things people do on a night out. He met a friend. He had drinks. He talked on the phone with his girlfriend. He moved between neighborhoods, went from one part of the city to another and back, connected with an acquaintance, ended up back at a favorite bar for the last stretch of the night. There is nothing in any of it that stands out as strange or ominous. It is the ordinary shape of a young person's night out, the loose, drifting, sociable progress of an evening at the start of a break. And that ordinariness is part of what makes the disappearance so hard to absorb, because there is no moment in the reconstructed night where you can point and say, there, that is where it started to go wrong. It all looks normal. Until suddenly Brian is gone. Investigators pored over every part of that night, trying to find the anomaly, the moment that did not fit, the detail that might explain what followed. They examined who Brian was with, where he went, what he did, how he seemed. And the picture that emerged was, frustratingly, a picture of an ordinary night, a young man behaving exactly as a young man behaves on a night out, with no clear sign of trouble, no visible threat, no obvious turning point. Whatever happened to Brian seems to have come without warning, out of the ordinary texture of a normal evening, which is exactly why it has been so hard to explain. There was no dramatic build-up, no visible danger, just an ordinary night that, at its very end, opened onto a mystery. Have you ever wondered how the most ordinary evening can turn, without warning, into a permanent mystery? How there can be no sign at all that a night is about to become the worst night in a family's life? Brian's last night is a study in exactly that. Nothing about it looked dangerous. Nothing marked it as different from 100 other nights. And yet somewhere in its ordinary progress, or just past its ordinary end, everything changed, and a young man stepped out of an ordinary frame and into a silence that has lasted 20 years. To be fair, that is often how these things happen, not with a warning, but without one, in the middle of the ordinary, which is part of why they are so frightening and so hard to foresee. At about 1:15 in the morning, the security cameras at the gateway recorded Brian, along with Clint and Meredith, riding the escalator up into the Ugly Tuna Saloona. There he is, on the footage, clearly and unmistakably a young man going up into the bar for the last part of the night. He is alive. He is present. He is captured on video entering the establishment. For the next stretch of time, Brian was inside the Ugly Tuna, in the ordinary crowd of a bar near closing time, one more young person out at the end of a March night. Nothing about his presence there was remarkable. He was simply at a bar, doing what people do at bars, with no sign that anything was wrong and no hint of what was about to become one of the strangest disappearances on record. The last confirmed sighting of Brian Shaffer came at about 1:55 in the morning. On the surveillance footage, Brian was recorded near the entrance to the bar, briefly speaking with two young women, an ordinary moment of conversation at the end of a night out. And then he walked out of the camera's frame. That is the last image the world has of Brian Shaffer, a young man talking to two women near the bar entrance in the small hours of the morning, and then stepping out of view. He did not look distressed. He did not appear to be in any danger. He simply moved out of the frame, the way people move out of frames all the time, and he was never captured on camera again. There's something quietly haunting about that last image, and it rewards a moment's attention. In it, Brian is doing the most ordinary thing in the world, standing near the entrance of a bar, talking to two young women, a completely unremarkable moment at the end of a night out. There is no drama in it, no sign of trouble, no hint that anything is about to go wrong. It is precisely the ordinariness of the image that makes it so eerie in hindsight. This is not a picture of a man in danger. It is a picture of a young man having a normal conversation on a normal night, and it happens to be the last time the world ever saw him. The two women he was speaking with, by the way, were identified and spoken to, and there is nothing to suggest they had any part in what followed. They were simply the last people captured in a frame with Brian, two more ordinary faces in an ordinary moment that turned out to be a threshold. There is a bitter irony in the fact that Brian disappeared from one of the most heavily watched kinds of places there is. We live in an age of cameras, and a modern entertainment complex like the South Campus Gateway is wrapped in them, watching the escalators and the entrances and the public spaces. In theory, a place like that should make disappearing almost impossible. Everywhere you go, you are seen. And yet, Brian vanished from exactly such a place, slipping through the gaps between the cameras, through a service door, or an unwatched moment, into a silence that all that surveillance could not prevent. The very abundance of cameras is part of what makes the case so strange, because it means we can see Brian right up to the edge of the mystery, and then, despite all those watching eyes, we lose him completely. You're surrounded by cameras in that gateway complex, in the bright watched world of a modern night out, and the irony of the case presses in. Here is a place designed to be seen, to be safe, to leave a record of everyone who passes through it. Here is Brian, captured again and again, on the escalator, in the bar, near the entrance with the two women. And here, in the middle of all that watching, is the gap he fell through, the unwatched door or the panning camera or the few unrecorded seconds, the small darkness that the great machinery of surveillance somehow left open. That a person could vanish from a place so thoroughly watched is one of the deep, unsettling truths of Brian's case, a reminder that even our most watched spaces have their blind spots, and that a person can slip through them and be gone. Have you ever wondered how, in a world so full of cameras, a person can still simply disappear? How all our watching can capture everything except the one thing that matters? Brian's case is the sharpest possible version of that question. We have so much footage of his last night, so many frames of him alive and present, and none of it shows the moment he disappeared. The cameras gave us everything except the answer. To be fair, that is the nature of surveillance, which records the ordinary faithfully and so often misses the crucial instant, the thing that happens in the one unwatched place. Brian slipped through exactly such a place, and all the watching in that bright modern complex could not hold on to him. At about 2 a.m, the Ugly Tuna Saloona closed, as bars do, emptying its patrons out into the night. Brian's companions, by the accounts given, assumed that he had left, that he had headed home the way people peel off from a group at the end of an evening. There was nothing alarming in his absence at first. People leave bars separately all the time. The friends went their ways into the closing night, and the assumption, reasonable at the time, was simply that Brian had done the same, that he had gone home to his apartment a few blocks away and would surface the next day. No one, in those first hours, had any reason to think that a young man had just vanished from the face of the earth. You're in the Ugly Tuna in the last minutes before closing, and it is the ordinary chaos of a bar at the end of a night. The lights coming up, the last drinks finished, the crowd beginning to thin and drift toward the escalator and the street below. Somewhere in that scene is Brian, present and alive, one face among many. And then, in the crush and the noise and the movement of a closing bar, something happens, or does not happen, that no one has ever been able to explain. Because when investigators later pulled the footage of that escalator, the one main route by which people came and went from the Ugly Tuna, they found something that turned an ordinary missing persons case into one of the most baffling disappearances in memory. They could see Brian going up. They could not find Brian coming down. Here is the fact that has haunted this case for 20 years, and it deserves to be stated as precisely as it can be. The escalator was the principal way in and out of the Ugly Tuna Saloona, and it was watched by a security camera. The footage from that camera captured Brian and his companions going up into the bar at about 1:15, and in the footage of people coming back down and leaving as the bar closed, Brian Shaffer does not appear. Investigators reviewed it carefully. By the account of one investigator, there was near total certainty that Brian did not leave the bar by that escalator. He went up on camera, and he never came back down on camera. And that simple, impossible-sounding fact, a man who entered a place and was never recorded leaving it, is the riddle at the center of everything. Now, we have to be careful and precise here, because the popular version of this case sometimes flattens into something more magical than the facts support, and the truth, while strange, is not supernatural. It is not quite right to say that Brian could not possibly have left the bar. What is accurate is that he was not recorded leaving by the monitored escalator, the main public way in and out. But the Ugly Tuna was a real building, not a sealed box, and real buildings have more than one door. There was, by the accounts, a service door in the bar, located near where Brian was last seen, and that service door led toward an area that was under construction at the time, an area that had its own exterior exit to the outside. In other words, there was at least one other way a person could physically have left the building, a back route through the construction zone, away from the watched escalator. That matters enormously, because it takes the case from the realm of the impossible and returns it to the realm of the merely mysterious. It is entirely possible that Brian left the Ugly Tuna not by the escalator, but through that service door and the construction area, out an exit that was not covered by a clear camera. And here is the other crucial detail. The cameras in some of the surrounding areas were not all fixed and continuous. Some of them panned back and forth or were operated manually, which means there were gaps, moments when a given spot was not being recorded. A person moving through the right place at the right moment could have passed unseen, not by magic, but by the simple, ordinary gaps in an imperfect system of cameras. So the honest way to state the mystery is this: Brian was not recorded leaving, and that is strange and important. But there were physical ways he could have left unseen, and the absence of footage is not proof that he never left. To be fair, that clarification cuts in more than one direction. On one hand, it dissolves the impossible, locked room quality that makes the case sound like a ghost story, and reminds us that Brian was a physical person in a physical building who could have walked out an unwatched door. On the other hand, it does not solve anything. If Brian did leave through that back exit into the construction area, we still do not know why, or where he went, or what happened to him after. The alternate exit explains how he might have left unseen. It does not explain the disappearance itself. It simply moves the mystery from inside the bar to the dark streets and construction zones just outside it, where the trail, wherever it led, has been cold for 20 years. Let's think about that dark space just outside the bar, because if Brian did leave that way, it is where his story took its turn, and it is worth understanding what kind of place it was. A construction area at night is a hazardous and disorienting environment, full of open spaces, unfinished floors, equipment, materials, and drops, the ordinary dangers of a building in the middle of being made. It is dark, uneven, and unfamiliar, exactly the kind of place where a person who is tired or impaired could come to harm entirely by accident. It is also, by the same token, a place with few or no cameras, a pocket of unwatched darkness in the middle of a heavily watched district. Whatever happened to Brian, if it happened just beyond that service door, it happened in a place designed to be temporary and rough, a place that has since been finished and changed, its secrets, if it held any, long since paved over. That is one of the quiet tragedies of the timing. The area Brian may have passed through was under construction then, and construction sites do not stay the same. Whatever state that space was in on the night Brian disappeared, it was transformed in the months and years afterward, finished and sealed and turned into ordinary, usable space. If there were traces there, they may have been lost in the building work. If there were hazards that harmed him, they may have been covered over. The very impermanence of a construction zone means that the place where Brian's trail may have ended was itself erased and rebuilt. Another way the case slipped through the world's fingers. To be fair, we do not know that Brian went that way at all. But if he did, the place that might have held the answer was, by its nature, a place that would not hold it for long. You're in the raw dark of that construction area in your imagination, just beyond the bright bar, and you can feel how completely a person could be lost there. Behind you is the warmth and light and noise of the Ugly Tuna, the ordinary watched world. Around you is the torn-up, unfinished, unlit space of a building being made, full of shadows and hazards and unwatched corners, opening somewhere onto the night outside. If Brian came this way, this is the threshold where the record ends, where the bright watched world gave way to the dark unwatched one, and where whatever happened to him happened beyond the reach of any camera or witness. It is an ordinary construction site, and it may be the last place Brian Shaffer ever was, and it gave nothing back. You're in the bar at that service door in your mind, the one near where Brian was last seen, looking through it toward the dim construction area and the exterior exit beyond, and you can feel how the whole case pivots on this small architectural detail. Through the bright bar behind you runs the ordinary world of the night, the crowd, the escalator, the cameras. Through the door in front of you lies a darker, rougher, less watched path to the outside, through the raw guts of a building under construction. If Brian went that way, he stepped from the recorded world into an unrecorded one, from the bright watch space into the dark unwatched space in a single step through an ordinary door. And on the far side of that door, the record simply ends and the mystery begins. Have you ever wondered how the smallest, most mundane details, a service door, a panning camera, a gap of a few seconds in a recording, can be the difference between a solved case and a mystery that lasts for decades? Brian's case turns on exactly such details. If every exit had been watched, we would know how he left. If the cameras had all been fixed and continuous, we might have seen where he went. Instead, the ordinary imperfections of a real building and a real security system left just enough darkness for a young man to disappear into, and that small margin of unwatched space has held its secret for 20 years. The mystery of Brian Shaffer is not a mystery of the impossible. It is a mystery of the ordinary gaps in an ordinary world, and of what happened to a grieving young man in the dark just beyond the reach of the cameras. The alarm was slow to rise because in the first hours there was no reason for alarm. Brian's friends assumed he had gone home. His absence looked at first like the ordinary way a night ends, people scattering to their own beds. But as the next day came and went with no word from Brian, the ordinary assumption curdled into worry. He did not answer his phone. He did not turn up where he was expected. His girlfriend, Alexis, could not reach him. And slowly, the people who loved Brian came to the frightening realization that no one knew where he was, that he had not simply gone home and slept in, that a young man who was reliable and connected had dropped out of contact entirely. The worry hardened into fear, and the fear into the understanding that Brian Shaffer was missing. When the search began, it deepened the mystery rather than easing it, because everywhere investigators looked, They found the ordinary signs of a life that Brian had simply never returned to. His apartment, only a few blocks from the bar, was undisturbed, with nothing to suggest he had come home or that anything was wrong there. His car remained parked where he had left it, untouched. He had not, by any sign, made it back to his own life after that night. The police searched widely and grimly, checking dumpsters and sewers and the surrounding area, looking for any trace of Brian in the physical landscape around the gateway. They reviewed footage from other nearby bars, hoping to catch a glimpse of him elsewhere in the district. They found nothing. No trace of Brian appeared anywhere, not in his home, not in his car, not on any other camera, not in any of the places a missing man might turn up. The thoroughness of that early search is worth understanding because it shows how hard investigators worked and how completely the case resisted them. They did not simply take a report and wait. They searched the physical environment around the gateway with the grim diligence that a possible death demands, checking places no one wants to look, the dumpsters and the drains and the hidden spaces of an urban district, on the chance that Brian had come to harm nearby. They pulled surveillance from the surrounding businesses and bars, trying to catch a single frame of Brian somewhere else in the district, some sign of him moving through the night after he left the Ugly Tuna. They canvassed and questioned and searched, and all of it came back empty. Brian did not appear on another camera, did not turn up in any of the search places, did not leave a single physical trace that anyone could find. That total absence of a trace is itself one of the strangest features of the case, and it cuts against several of the theories at once. If Brian had an accident just outside the bar, you might expect some sign of it to have been found in all that searching. If he was harmed nearby, you might expect some trace, and yet there was nothing, no body, no blood, no dropped belonging, no later sighting, no digital footprint, nothing. It is as though Brian stepped out of that camera frame and out of the physical record of the world entirely. That completeness is part of what has fed the more dramatic theories, the sense that an ordinary accident or crime should have left something behind, and this left nothing. To be fair, absence of evidence is not always evidence of anything in particular, and a city offers many places a trace could be lost. But the sheer cleanness of Brian's disappearance, the way he left no trace at all, is one of its defining and most haunting qualities. You're standing in the aftermath of that empty search, and the silence of it is its own kind of horror. Every place a missing person might turn up has been checked, and everyone has come back empty. There is the untouched apartment. There is the parked car. There are the dumpsters and drains that held nothing, the neighboring cameras that caught nothing, the whole search district that gave back nothing. A young man has been erased from the physical world so completely that the enormous effort to find any sign of him has failed entirely. That kind of clean, total absence is rare even in disappearances, and it is part of why Brian's case has haunted so many people for so long. He did not just vanish. He vanished without leaving a single thread to pull. You're in Columbus in the days after Brian vanished, and the search has the peculiar desperation of a case with no trail to follow. There is the bar and the escalator and the footage that shows him going up and never coming down. There is the apartment, untouched, waiting for a young man who never came home. There is the car, parked and silent. And there is the growing, sickening realization that a person can vanish from the middle of a modern city surrounded by cameras and people, and leave behind almost nothing to follow. The investigators did the thorough, grim work of searching, and the searches came back empty, and the case settled into the shape it has held for 20 years. A young man gone without a trace from inside an ordinary night. Now we come to a part of the story that requires real care, the question of the people who were with Brian that night, and we are going to handle it the way we handle every such question, with a firm commitment to the presumption of innocence. The friend who was with Brian for much of the evening, Clint Florence, has, over the years, become a focus of attention and of suspicion, some of it voiced publicly by members of Brian's own family. It has been reported that Florence declined to take a polygraph examination, and that Brian's brother and girlfriend, in their grief and their search for answers, came to feel that he might know more than he has said. These are documented parts of the case, and we report them because they are part of the honest record. But we have to be extremely clear about what these facts do and do not mean, because this is exactly where a story like Brian's can slide into unfairness. Clint Florence has never been charged with any crime. There is no evidence that he did anything to harm Brian. The suspicion that is attached to him comes from the anguish of a family desperate for answers and from the simple fact that he was one of the last people with Brian. And neither of those things is evidence of wrongdoing. As for the polygraph, we should be honest about what that means. A person has every right to decline a polygraph, and many lawyers advise their clients to do exactly that, because polygraphs are notoriously unreliable and their results are not even admissible in court in most circumstances. Declining a polygraph is not evidence of guilt. It is the exercise of a right, and innocent people decline them all the time, on the sound advice of counsel. To be fair, we can understand completely why Brian's family feels as they do. When you have lost someone and cannot find them, when the last hours are murky and the answers will not come, the mind reaches for the people who are there, searching their words and their silences for the truth. That reaching is human and forgivable, and it does not require us to join it. We can hold the family's anguish with compassion and still insist on fairness for a man who has never been charged. The plain fact is that after 20 years, there is no evidence that Clint Florence or anyone else who was with Brian that night did him any harm, and the presumption of innocence is not a courtesy we extend only when it is easy. It is a principle we hold precisely when a case is murky and the temptation to accuse is strong. So we hold it. We name the people who are there because the record names them, and we accuse no one because the evidence accuses no one. Have you ever wondered how easily suspicion can fill the vacuum left by an unsolved case, how the absence of an answer pulls our minds toward the nearest available person, whether or not the evidence supports it? Brian's case is a standing example of that pull. The people who were with him that night have lived for 20 years under the weight of public suspicion, not because evidence pointed at them, but because they were there, and because a grieving family and a curious public needed somewhere to look. We are not going to add to that. A wrongly suspected person is a second kind of victim, and the way to honor Brian is to find the truth, not to manufacture a culprit out of proximity and grief, which is to say that the honest position, the only fair one, is that we do not know what happened to Brian, and that no one who was with him has ever been shown to be responsible. Brian's case has drawn an enormous amount of attention over the years, especially online. And that attention has a shadow side that bears directly on the fairness we keep insisting upon. The clean, locked room strangeness of the disappearance made it a favorite subject for internet speculation. And over time, the people who were with Brian that night, and the friend in particular who became a focus of the family's suspicion, have been discussed, named, and effectively tried by strangers who were not there and have no evidence. That is a real harm done to real people. When a crowd of anonymous investigators decides, on no proof, that a specific person is guilty, they can damage that person's life in ways that no acquittal can undo, because there was never a trial, only a verdict handed down by rumor. We are not going to take part in that, and we would gently ask everyone who cares about this case not to either. The friend who declined a polygraph has never been charged, and there is no evidence he harmed Brian, and the internet's long campaign of suspicion against him is not justice. It is the opposite. To be fair, the impulse behind it is often not cruelty but caring, a desire for an answer, a wish to help Brian's family. But caring does not license accusation, and a wish for answers does not make a guess into a fact. The honest and the decent thing is to keep the attention pointed at finding Brian and away from convicting the uncharged, and that is the line we hold. So let's lay out the possibilities that remain, carefully and fairly, without forcing a choice among them. Broadly, the theories about Brian's disappearance fall into a few categories, and each fits some of the facts while straining against others. There is the possibility of foul play, that someone did Brian harm that night. There is the possibility of an accident, that some misadventure befell him after he left the bar. And there is the possibility of a voluntary disappearance, that Brian, grieving and overwhelmed, chose to walk away from his life. Each of these is possible. None of them has ever been proven. And the honest work is to hold them all gently in the open, rather than to seize on the one that makes the most dramatic story. Take the possibility of foul play or an accident first, because the two are linked by the same window of opportunity, the dark, unwatched space just outside the bar. If Brian left through that service door and the construction area, he stepped into a rough, unlit, torn-up environment in the middle of the night, exactly the kind of place where an accident could happen to an impaired young man, a fall, a mishap in a hazardous construction zone. It is also the kind of unwatched place where if someone meant him harm, there would have been no camera to record it. Both the accident and the foul play possibilities live in that same dark margin just beyond the reach of the footage, and both remain genuinely open. To be fair, extensive searching of the area around the bar turned up no trace of Brian, which complicates the simplest accident theory, but the searches could not cover every possibility, and the dark space outside that service door remains one of the real candidates for where his story turned. Then there is the voluntary disappearance theory, and here we have to move with special care and compassion, because it touches Brian's grief and his private inner life, and because it would be so easy to handle it clumsily. The theory, in its gentlest form, goes like this. Brian had just lost his mother. He was carrying a fresh and heavy grief, and some people have wondered whether, in the weight of that loss, he might have chosen to step away from his life, to walk off into a new beginning somewhere else, to simply leave the pain behind. It is a theory that has drawn support from the strange details The way he seemed to vanish so cleanly, the fact that the alternate exit offered a way out unseen, the absence of any clear evidence of harm. But we have to be careful and humble about this, and we have to keep a promise we made at the start. We are not going to diagnose Brian, not going to presume to know the inner state of a grieving young man we never met, not going to turn his private pain into a neat explanation for a convenient story. It is one thing to note that grief can move people in unpredictable ways, that a fresh and terrible loss can leave a person disoriented and not fully themselves. It is another thing entirely to declare that this is what happened to Brian, to reduce a real and complex young man to a tidy narrative of a griever who walked away. We do not know that he did. There are things that argue against it. The life he was engaged in, the relationship, the studies, the total absence of any preparation or trace of a new life anywhere in the 20 years since. The voluntary disappearance theory is a possibility, and we hold it as one, gently, without endorsing it and without pretending to see into a heart we cannot see. You're sitting with the hardest and most human version of the mystery now, the question of what was happening inside Brian in those grieving weeks. And it is a question that has no answer we can reach. Here is a young man who has just lost his mother, out at a bar at the start of a break, carrying a weight no one else could fully see. What was he feeling that night? What was in his mind when he stepped out of the camera's view? We cannot know. His inner life on that last night is as lost to us as his body, and any confident claim about it is a guess dressed up as knowledge. To be fair, that uncertainty is uncomfortable, because we want to understand, and understanding a person's state of mind feels like it should be possible. But it is not here, and the respectful thing is to admit it, to hold Brian's grief with tenderness, and to refuse to weaponize it into a theory. Over the years, a series of possible leads surfaced, and each one flickered with hope, before fading into nothing, and they are worth walking through, because they show both how hard people searched and how stubbornly the case has resisted an answer. Some months after Brian vanished, there was an episode in which his girlfriend's phone reportedly rang, seemingly from Brian's number, and a cell signal was said to have pinged from a tower near Hilliard, a community some miles northwest of Columbus. For a moment, it raised the electric possibility that Brian was alive and out there somewhere, but the phone company attributed the event to a technical glitch, and it led nowhere. It was a false dawn, one of several, a flicker of hope that dissolved on examination. There were others. At one point, a cruel hoax surfaced, a false message purporting to bring word of Brian, which was traced to a public computer and turned out to be nothing but someone's heartless deception. Years later, a photograph of a homeless man in another country circulated, with people wondering whether it might be Brian, until facial recognition analysis ruled him out. And at the 20-year distance, investigators released an age-progressed image, a computer-generated impression of what Brian might look like as a middle-aged man, in the hope that someone, somewhere, might recognize him. Each of these was a thread pulled in the long search, and each of them, in the end, led back to the same place, to the absence of Brian and the absence of an answer. There's something especially poignant about that age-progressed image, and it is worth sitting with. When investigators release a computer-generated picture of what a missing person might look like years later, they are doing something quietly heartbreaking. They are imagining a future for someone who is frozen in time, aging a face forward through years the person may never have lived, in the hope that the imagined older self might match a real face somewhere in the world. For Brian, that meant a picture of a man in his 40s, the medical career he never got to have written invisibly into the lines of an imagined face, a version of him that might be walking around somewhere or might not exist at all. It is an act of hope and an act of grief at the same time. The attempt to picture a life that was interrupted at 27 and may have ended there. You're looking at that imagined older face, and it opens a door onto everything Brian lost. Here is the doctor he might have become, the husband and perhaps father, the man who would have aged out of the bright, grieving 27-year-old into the fullness of a life. That imagined face carries all the unlived years, the patients he might have healed, the family he might have raised, the ordinary decades that were taken from him along with his life, if his life was taken. To be fair, the age progression is only a guess, a computer's best estimate, and Brian may look nothing like it, or may not be alive to look like anything. But it is a way of insisting that Brian would be a real, living, aging person now if the world had been kinder, and of keeping the search alive by imagining the man he might have grown into. It is the search reaching forward in time, refusing to leave Brian frozen at the edge of that camera frame. To be fair, the pattern of false leads is not a sign that no one cared or that the search was careless. It is the opposite. It is the sign of a case worked hard for 2 decades, every possibility chased down, every flicker of hope examined by investigators and by a family that would not give up. The dead ends are the footprints of an enormous effort, and they are also a measure of how deep the silence at the center of this case runs, that after 20 years of searching, of chasing every phone ping and photograph and rumor, the fundamental question remains exactly where it was on the morning of April 1st, 2006. Where is Brian Shaffer? No lead has ever answered it. We should also set aside, firmly, one theory that attached itself to Brian's case as it did to many others, the idea that his disappearance was the work of some roaming serial killer targeting young men, a notion that circulated widely for a time. It is worth mentioning only to dismiss it, because the authorities did exactly that. Both the Columbus police and the federal authorities rejected the serial killer framing as applied to cases like Brian's, finding no evidence to support it. It is one of those theories that spreads because it offers a shape and a villain, where the truth offers only a blank, and it is precisely the kind of unfounded framing this channel declines to indulge. There is no evidence that Brian was the victim of any such killer, and we set the idea aside where it belongs. Through all of it, the years and the false leads and the unanswered questions, Brian's family has carried the search, and their endurance is one of the quiet heartbreaks of this story. Brian's father, Randy, and his brother, Derek, and his girlfriend, Alexis, lived through not one loss, but 2 in close succession: the death of Renee, and then, only weeks later, the vanishing of Brian. Imagine the cruelty of that. A family already in the depths of grief for a wife and mother suddenly plunged into the entirely different agony of a son and brother who is simply gone, with no body, no grave, no answer. They had to grieve Renee with certainty and Brian with none. the two losses tangled together in the same terrible spring. Randy Shaffer, Brian's father, became the steady public voice of the search, speaking about his son year after year, keeping Brian's name and face before the public, asking again and again for anyone who knew anything to come forward. He did this while carrying his own grief, the loss of his wife and the disappearance of his son, a weight that would have crushed many people. Until his own passing in later years, he kept faith with the search, kept hoping for the day he might learn what happened to Brian, that a father could endure so much and still stand up again and again to speak for his lost son is a testament to the fierce and stubborn love that these cases so often reveal, the love that refuses to let a missing person be forgotten. The disappearance also left a lasting mark on Columbus and on Ohio State, the community where Brian vanished. A university district is a place of transient youth, thousands of young people passing through on their way to their adult lives, and Brian's disappearance became part of the memory of the place, a story woven into the campus and the nightlife district, a name that still surfaces when people talk about the Gateway or about the strange things that can happen on an ordinary night out. Over the years, the case has been revisited in the local media on its anniversaries, on the 10th year, and later, and at the long, sobering mark of 20 years. Each revisiting is a small act of remembrance, a refusal to let Brian slip entirely out of the community's memory, and a renewed appeal for the information that might finally solve the case. Every spring, as the anniversary of Brian's disappearance comes around, the case returns to the surface. There are stories marking the years. There are renewed appeals. There is the painful ritual of remembering, of speaking Brian's name again, of reminding everyone that a young man vanished here and was never found. It would be easier to let the date pass in silence, and no one would blame a grieving family for wanting that. But the family, while they were able, chose the harder path, understanding that public attention is what keeps an unsolved case alive, that the moment a case falls silent is the moment it is most likely to die. And so Brian is remembered year after year against the natural pull of forgetting. You're at one of those anniversary moments, years into the case, and you can feel the mixture of grief and stubborn hope that holds it together. There is Brian's face, still 27, on the posters and the screens. There is the family, marked by 2 decades of a particular kind of waiting. There is a community that has not quite let him go, and reporters who still come, and the appeal spoken once more, the same request that has gone out for years, that somebody, somewhere, who knows something, will finally come forward. It is a scene of sorrow, and it is also a scene of quiet devotion, a family and a community refusing to let the silence have the last word. Over the years, Brian's case has been retold many times in news features, in documentaries, in the vast and growing world of true crime media, and that retelling is a double-edged thing that deserves a fair word. On one hand, every responsible retelling keeps the case alive, puts Brian's face in front of new people, and carries the appeal for information to audiences that might include the one person who knows something. That is genuinely valuable, and it is part of why a case from 2006 is still discussed at all. On the other hand, not every retelling is careful, and the case has sometimes been treated as a spooky curiosity, a locked room riddle stripped of its human weight, or an occasion to accuse the uncharged. The difference between the two kinds of telling matters enormously, and it is the difference we are trying to honor tonight. The responsible way to tell Brian's story is the way that keeps him human, that holds to the facts, that protects the innocent, and that never loses sight of the real family at the center. To be fair, the appetite for mystery is not going away, and cases like Brian's will keep being told, and that is not a bad thing in itself. But how they are told is a choice, and it is a choice with consequences for real and living people. We can tell this story in a way that helps, that keeps the case alive and points toward the truth and harms no one. Or we can tell it in a way that turns a family's tragedy into cheap entertainment and grinds the reputations of the uncharged. We are trying as hard as we can to tell it the first way, because that is the only way that honors Brian. You're watching a family absorb 2 devastations in a single season and somehow keep going, and it is almost more than the mind can hold. There is the fresh grave of a mother. There is the empty, unanswered absence of a son. There is a father standing between the two, grieving one and searching for the other, holding a family together through a double catastrophe. The Shaffer family did not have the mercy of a single loss to absorb. They had 2 at once, one certain and one endless, and they carried both with a dignity that ought to humble anyone who hears their story. Their endurance is the reason Brian's name is still spoken, and it is the human heart of a case that might otherwise be only a strange puzzle. There is a particular kind of grief in what the Shaffer family carries, and it has a name. Psychologists call it ambiguous loss, the grief of a person who is gone but not confirmed gone, absent in body but unresolved in fact. It denies the mind the terrible mercy of certainty. A family in ambiguous loss cannot fully mourn, because mourning feels like a betrayal of hope, and cannot fully hope because hope feels like a denial of reason. And in the Shaffer's case, that ambiguous loss sat right beside a certain one, the death of Renee, so that the family had to hold 2 entirely different kinds of grief at the same time, the settled grief of a death and the endless, open grief of a disappearance. To grieve one person you have buried and another you cannot find in the same season is a burden almost beyond describing. The 2 losses would have interfered with each other in cruel ways. The certainty of Renee's death offered the ordinary, painful path of mourning, the funeral, the grave, the slow work of grief. The uncertainty of Brian's disappearance offered no such path, no place to go, no fact to build around, only the open question renewed every morning. A family needs to be able to grieve its dead, and the Shaffers could grieve Renee, but the same weeks that asked them to mourn a mother also plunged them into the very different agony of a son who was simply gone, whose fate they could not learn, whose absence had no floor and no ceiling. It is hard to imagine a heavier combination of sorrows, and they carried it with a grace that deserves to be honored. You're inside that double grief with the Shaffer family, and it is a country few people ever have to enter. On one side is a grave, a place to bring flowers, a loss that at least has the shape of a loss. On the other side is an open door, a question with no answer, a son who might be anywhere or nowhere, whose absence cannot be laid to rest because it cannot be confirmed. The family lives between the two, grieving in 2 different ways at once and doing it year after year, decade after decade. That they have survived it at all is remarkable. That they have survived it and kept searching, kept speaking Brian's name, kept the case alive is something close to heroic. Living with no answer is a specific kind of endurance, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms. Most griefs, however terrible, eventually give the grieving something solid to build around, a fact, a date, a place, a certainty that lets the slow work of mourning begin. A disappearance offers none of that. It asks a family to build a life on a question, to go on year after year with the central fact of their loss unknown and perhaps unknowable. There is no natural end to it, no point at which the grief is allowed to resolve, because the thing that would allow resolution, the truth, never comes. The family simply carries the open question forward through the years, a weight that does not lighten because it never sets down. And yet people do carry it, which is one of the quiet astonishments of the human capacity to endure. The Shaffer family carried it through a father's remaining years and a brother's ongoing life and a girlfriend's grief, holding Brian's absence alongside all the other business of living, refusing to let the open question either destroy them or be forgotten. That is not the same as healing, and they would be the first to say so. It is something harder and more stubborn, the daily choice to keep going, to keep hoping, to keep the search alive, in the face of a silence that gives back nothing. To be fair, no one should have to do it, and the fact that families do is not a reason to ask any less of the world in trying to spare them. But their endurance is real, and it deserves to be seen and honored. The long, quiet heroism of carrying a question that will not close. You're watching a family carry that open question across 20 years, and it reframes what strength even means. It is not the dramatic strength of a single hard moment. It is the slow, grinding strength of getting up every day into a world where your son is still missing, of marking every anniversary, of answering every reporter, of holding on to hope when hope has grown thin for 2 decades without the relief of an answer. That is a kind of courage that rarely gets named because it is quiet and it is long and it has no clear victory at the end. But it is courage all the same, and the Shaffer family has shown it in Brian's name for 20 years. Have you ever wondered how a family survives losing 2 people in the space of weeks, one to death and one to a mystery, and still finds the strength to keep searching year after year? The Shaffers lived that, and their persistence has kept Brian's case alive for 20 years. 20 years on, the case remains open. The Columbus police have kept it active, still receiving the occasional tip, still holding, by their own account, a small number of working theories that they decline to discuss in public. An open case is a case that can still be solved, still capable of yielding an answer if the right piece of information finally arrives. To be fair, 20 years is a very long time, and the odds lengthen with each passing year. But the case is not closed, and Brian is not forgotten, and the question of what happened to him is still, in principle, answerable. It is worth asking why Brian's case, out of the many missing persons cases of its era, has held the public's imagination so tightly for so long, because the answer says something about the case and about us. Part of it is the clean, almost mathematical strangeness of the central fact, a man who went into a place and was never recorded coming out. That has the shape of a riddle, a locked room puzzle, and human beings are irresistibly drawn to riddles. It gives the mind something to chew on, a specific and bounded mystery that feels, deceptively, like it should be solvable if only we look at the footage one more time, Think about the exits one more way. The case invites everyone to become a detective, and a great many people have accepted the invitation. But we should be honest that the very quality that makes the case so compelling is also a kind of trap, because it can pull attention away from the human beings at the center. A riddle is fun to solve. A grieving family's loss is not a game. And there is a danger with a case like Brian's that the puzzle box overshadows the person, that Brian becomes the man who vanished from the bar rather than the grieving son studying to be a doctor, that his friends and family become characters in a mystery rather than real people living a real tragedy. To be fair, the fascination has also kept the case alive, kept Brian's name in front of the world, and that is genuinely valuable. But the task, for anyone who cares about this case, is to hold on to the human beings inside the puzzle, to remember that the locked room has a real young man inside it and a real family standing outside, waiting. Have you ever wondered whether our fascination with a mystery can sometimes get in the way of the compassion the people inside it deserve? Whether the puzzle can crowd out the person? Brian's case is a test of exactly that. It is one of the most compelling disappearance riddles of its generation, and it is also the story of a young man who had just lost his mother and then lost his own future, and of a family that lost two people in a single spring. Both things are true. The trick is to let the mystery draw us in without letting it turn Brian into a mere puzzle, to keep the fascination in service of the search and the compassion at the center where it belongs. That is what we are trying to do tonight, to honor the riddle and the person at once. There is a deeper reason that a disappearance like Brian's haunts us in a way that even a death often does not, and it is worth naming. A death, however painful, is a completed thing. It has a shape, an ending, a place to put our grief. A disappearance has none of that. It is a story with the last page torn out, a sentence that stops in the middle, and something in the human mind cannot rest with an unfinished story. We are built to want resolution, to need the ending that makes sense of everything before it. A disappearance denies us that, and so it lingers, unresolved, in a way that a completed tragedy does not. That is part of why Brian's case, and cases like it, hold on to us for decades, because they leave a question open in the mind that the mind cannot close. For the family, of course, that open question is not a fascination, but a torment, the difference between an audience and the people who actually live inside the loss. What is an intriguing, unsolved mystery to a stranger is, to a parent or a sibling, the central, unbearable fact of their lives. It is worth holding both of those truths at once, the genuine pull of the mystery and the genuine suffering of the people inside it, and letting the second temper the first. To be fair, the fascination is not wrong in itself, and it has done real good in keeping cases alive. But it should always be accompanied by the awareness that the puzzle is someone's tragedy, that the open question we find so compelling is the same open question that has broken a family's heart for 20 years. You're holding both of those things now, the mystery and the mourning, and that is the honest way to sit with a case like Brian's. On one hand, there is the genuine, undeniable pull of the riddle, the man who went in and never came out, the answer that seems to hover just past the last frame of the footage. On the other hand, there is a real young man who was loved and lost, and a real family who have grieved him for 2 decades, and the plain human tragedy underneath the puzzle. To hold both is to be drawn in by the mystery without forgetting the person, to let curiosity serve compassion rather than replace it. And that, in the end, is the only way to tell a story like Brian's that does justice to everyone it touches, which is to say that the thing this case most needs is the same thing it has always needed: a single person deciding to speak. Somewhere, it is entirely possible there is a person who knows something about what happened to Brian Shaffer after he stepped out of that camera's frame, something they have never told, whether out of fear or guilt or a mistaken sense that it does not matter. Over the years, the surviving footage of Brian's last night has been studied more intensely than almost any comparable record, and that intense study is its own quiet portrait of the case. Investigators, journalists, and countless members of the public have watched those frames again and again. The escalator, the bar, the last moment near the entrance with the two women searching for something everyone else has missed, some overlooked detail that might unlock the whole thing. The footage has been slowed, enhanced, dissected, and debated. And still, it gives up nothing more than it has always given: a young man alive and present, and then, past the edge of the frame, gone. The answer feels like it should be in there somewhere in those few precious minutes of video, and it never quite is. That is a specific kind of torment, the sense that the answer is almost within reach, sitting in a handful of frames that we can watch as many times as we like, and yet staying forever just out of grasp. It is different from a case with no evidence at all. Brian's case has evidence, has actual video of his last night, and that very richness makes the blank at the end more maddening, not less. We can see him. We can watch him right up to the threshold of the mystery. And then the frames run out, and the answer is on the other side of them, in the unrecorded dark, where no amount of rewatching can follow. The footage brings us achingly close, and then stops, and the closeness is part of the pain. Cases like Brian's, where the trail ends so cleanly at the edge of the cameras, are often waiting on exactly that, on the one person who holds a piece of the truth, finally setting it down. The escalator footage has been studied to exhaustion. The building has been mapped. What remains is the human silence just beyond the last frame, and only a human voice can break it. If you are listening tonight and you know anything at all about what happened to Brian Shaffer, anything you saw or heard or were told in the years since that night in 2006, please contact the Columbus Division of Police or the appropriate authorities. Even a small detail, a memory that has stayed with you, could be the thread that finally brings Brian home and gives his family the answer they have sought for 20 years. Please verify the current tip lines and any reward before relying on them, because such details change over time. But do not assume that what you know is too small to matter. In a case that hinges on the smallest of gaps, the smallest piece of truth could be the one that finally closes it. There's real reason to believe a case like Brian's can still be solved, even 20 years on, because cases far older have broken open in recent years. Sometimes it is science, when preserved evidence is tested with methods that did not exist at the time, or when remains are finally found and identified. Sometimes it is conscience, when a person who has carried a secret for many years finally sets it down, tells someone, picks up a phone. Relationships change over the decades, loyalties shift, The reasons a person stayed silent fall away, and the truth they were holding finally comes out. Many old cases end not with a laboratory breakthrough, but with a human being who simply could not carry the weight any longer. Brian's case could end in any of those ways, or in some way no one has yet imagined. If Brian's remains are somewhere, waiting, they could still be found, and modern identification could still name him and bring him home. If there is a person who knows something, anything, about what happened after he stepped out of that frame, they could still come forward. The footage and the maps and the case files are all still there, ready to be joined to whatever new piece finally emerges. To be fair, there's no guarantee, and 20 years of silence is a hard thing to break. But the case is genuinely open and genuinely capable of resolution, which is more than can be said for many cases of its age. It is worth pausing to consider what an answer would mean for the people who have waited so long, because it is not a simple thing. On one hand, an answer would end the ambiguous grief the family has lived in for 20 years, would replace the endless not knowing with solid ground, however painful. Most families in this situation want the truth above all, even a hard truth, because the not knowing is its own unbearable weight. To finally learn what happened to Brian, to be able to bring him home, would be, in its way, a mercy, even if it confirmed the worst. On the other hand, an answer would also settle the long question of the people who were with him that night, one way or another, and free the innocent from a suspicion they have carried for 2 decades. Either way, the truth would do what the truth does, replacing 100 imagined stories with a single real one and freeing everyone from the prison of the unknown. Have you ever wondered whether the cases that refuse to leave us are the ones that most need us to keep watching, the ones where our collective attention is not idle curiosity but a kind of long vigil? Brian's may be one of those. For 20 years, a great many strangers have kept his story alive alongside his family, and that shared attention, kept respectful and kept kind, is part of what still gives the case a chance. Every time his name is spoken with care, every time the facts are told fairly and the innocent are protected, the odds tick up, however slightly, that the story will reach the one person who can finally end it. Which is to say that remembering Brian, honestly and fairly, is not a passive act. It is part of the search itself, a search that continues in every mind that refuses to let him go. The responsibility that comes with that attention is simple to state, even if it is hard to live. Keep the interest pointed at finding Brian and away from harming the living. Share accurate information. Keep his name and face before the world. Point anyone with real knowledge toward the authorities who can act on it. But refuse to accuse the uncharged. Refuse to convict people the law never charged. Refuse to turn a family's tragedy into a spectacle at the expense of real and living people. That is how a case is kept alive without doing harm. And it is the only way worthy of Brian, who was himself the victim of a terrible injustice and would not want injustice done to others in his name. Let's come back, at the end, to Brian himself, because in all the talk of escalators and exits and theories, it is easy to lose the young man at the center, and he deserves to be remembered as more than the riddle of the bar. Brian Shaffer was 27 years old, a bright and kind young man studying to become a doctor, someone who wanted to spend his life helping other people heal. He was a son who had just lost his mother a brother, a partner, a friend. He was, by every account, warm and well-liked, a person with a future in medicine and a whole life ahead of him. On the night he vanished, he was a grieving young man out at the start of a break, doing nothing more unusual than being 27 on a night out. Whatever happened to him, he did not deserve it, and he was so much more than the mystery he became. Think about everything that was lost when Brian vanished, not only from him, but from the world. He was training to be a doctor. Somewhere in the future that was taken from him were the patients he would have cared for, the people he would have healed, the ordinary daily good that a physician does across a career. A person who chooses medicine chooses a life of service. And Brian was years into the hard work of preparing for exactly that. All of it was erased in a single night. The whole unlived career, the decades of patience and colleagues and quiet good work gone before it could begin. When we mourn Brian, we mourn not only the young man who disappeared, but the doctor he never got to become, and everyone whose life would have been touched by his care. We mourn, too, the ordinary human future that was taken, the same one that is taken in all these cases, and that is so easy to forget. Brian would be in his 40s now, a grown man with a life we can only imagine, the young medical student long behind him. He might have married, might have raised children, might have built the quiet, meaningful life that his training was pointed toward. All of that unlived life is part of the loss, the years and the joys and the ordinary days that were stolen from him, along with whatever else was taken. His family does not grieve a case or a puzzle. They grieve a son and a brother, a specific young man with a specific future, and the incalculable weight of everything he would have done and been. To be fair, it is hard to hold on to all of that when the case is so consuming as a mystery, when the escalator and the exits and the 20 years of speculation crowd in and threaten to reduce Brian to a riddle. But we have to try, because he deserves it, and because the whole point of telling his story with care is to keep him human. Brian Shaffer was not a locked room puzzle or an unsolved file. He was a beloved son and brother and partner, a grieving young man on his way to becoming a healer whose absence has left a hole in the world that 20 years have not filled. That is who we are talking about tonight. That is who we are trying to honor, and that is who the truth, whenever it finally comes, will be for. Remember Brian tonight not as a locked room puzzle or an internet curiosity, but as the young man he was, loved and grieving and full of promise. Remember the family who lost a mother and a son in the same terrible spring, and who searched for Brian with a devotion that ought to move anyone. And remember the fairness we owe to everyone in this story, the refusal to accuse the innocent, the discipline of holding to what is known, which is not coldness, but a kind of respect for Brian and for the truth alike. He was a real person, and his story is still unfinished, and unfinished is not the same as forgotten. Somewhere, the truth of what happened to Brian Shaffer still exists, held in the world or in someone's memory, waiting for the day it is finally spoken. Until that day, we keep his name where it belongs, in the light, spoken with care. He was here. He mattered to everyone who knew him, and he matters still. And his family's long search and the enduring attention of everyone who refuses to let him be forgotten is itself a kind of faith that the truth is not gone forever, only waiting. Rest easy, Brian, and may the answer your family sought for so long finally, at last, come home.